Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H event space. A huge congratulations to the Huskers for their big win this weekend. I'm sorry, the green room conversation kind of bled into this. I couldn't help it, Autumn. I had to do it. Had to. You know I have a problem, censoring myself, keeping my mouth shut. So that's how we're leading in
Love it.
today. Autumn, welcome back for what you do best, 10 landscape. See, I need to focus more on my verbiage. Landscape photography tips. But Autumn, if you haven't seen her on this channel, where have you been? She's a regular here. Huge thank you to her and Sony. Autumn, what's going on?
Hey, not a lot. Stoked to be here as always.
Great to have you on as always. I'm going to kick it over to you and remind everybody, if you guys do have any questions at all, drop it into the YouTube chat. I'm going to let Autumn do her thing. I'll see you in a bit for some Q&A.
All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me today and happy Moon Day. I'm really excited to be here to share with you 10 landscape photography tips that I've learned over the years. Patience and perseverance go a long way with landscape photography. But if you're newer to landscapes, I've been there. I know how exciting it can be to jump into a new type of photography. And we live in the age of instant gratification, right? So it's hard to not to want to see quick results with everything that we take on these days. We have so much knowledge just right at our fingertips. And so I figured that sharing some of the tips that I've learned, over my journey could possibly help speed up your photography journey and, get you taking more photos that you're stoked on. So let's hop right into the presentation. So I'll share my screen here. All right, hopefully you can see that. All right, so jumping right in, let's go to tip number one. Gear does matter to an extent. I see a lot of back and forth online about gear. Like some people are in the like it doesn't matter, it's the photographer camp, and some people are in the like you can't be a good photographer unless you have like the best, most expensive gear. And personally, I think it falls somewhere more in the middle. Like having good gear does matter and it will help you to take better photos, but it isn't the like be all end all. It's not like some magic tool that, suddenly if you buy the most expensive camera, you're gonna be like the best photographer ever. But here's a little secret. If you buy a Sony, you actually will be better than the rest. That's just the rules. I didn't make them up, but no. But seriously, investing in better gear will allow you to capture moments that you couldn't with lower quality gear. So for instance, I'm thinking about like telephoto lenses. They tend to be a little bit pricier, but telephoto compression is very, very difficult to replicate, especially like if you're trying to do that in post-processing. Like it's very difficult to kind of replicate what a telephoto lens does with compression. My favorite is the Sony 100 to 400 millimeter G Master lens. As much as you can try, like if you only have a 50 millimeter lens, you just aren't going to be able to capture the same thing that a telephoto lens will. And then, quality comes into play. Like that's why I love Sony's G Master line of lenses. Like they are pricier, yes, but for a reason. Like they are so worth it. And they're lenses that are optically incredibly good that you'll be able to own and to use for like so many years. So a low quality lens is pretty easy to spot, especially for the trained eye. Often low quality lenses will have like a lot of aberrations or imperfections that you really don't want. Things like softness, vignetting, distortion, like sharp and kind of weird looking bokeh in the background, and chromatic aberration, which is probably my least favorite type of lens aberration, of a lens imperfection. It's really difficult to edit this out. If you've ever seen like any strange colors or like fringing around like the objects in your photos, that's chromatic aberration, and it's quite common with lower quality glass. And Like I said, it's really difficult to edit this out, and it's just so time consuming. And this is a pretty severe example where you can really see the chromatic aberration around the edges, and like all of these branches are basically just purple. And it's typically more prominent in daytime shots, but it can definitely be a problem for night sky photos as well. Like you can get away with it more because it's less noticeable and it's smaller, but you can still see the magenta kind of surrounding all of these brighter stars. And it becomes much more evident when you're printing your photos as well. So that's something to keep in mind if you do any printing. And for camera bodies, things like autofocus subject detection, burst shooting speeds, low light capabilities, high resolution for cropping, like all of these things are important features to consider depending on what you like to photograph. You'll get better quality results with higher end gear, but like I said, that doesn't mean that like suddenly your compositions and all of your editing and everything is just going to be like figured out for you. Like you have to work with your gear to improve, but better gear can definitely help you capture some of those moments that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. And also, the better that you understand your gear, the more not only you understand its capabilities, but also its limitations. A lot of landscape photography moments can actually be quite fleeting. I think we think of landscape as this very like chill and calming thing, but often, those beautiful sunrise and sunset colors can like appear and disappear in the blink of an eye. And so being able to have your gear dialed in a way that will allow you to capture those special moments instead of like fumbling around with your settings, trying to figure out where your white balance is and things like that. So the bottom line is that higher quality gear does matter, but it won't instantly make you a better photographer unless you shoot Sony. All right, tip number 2, go often as you can. Most of landscape photography is gambling, like it's playing odds. Will it be a good sunset? Will the clouds pop off or will it just like kind of turn to gray? Reading clouds and how they might react, with the sun is a key component of landscape photography. But even if you're not sure how to do that, or even if you are sure, even if you do know how to do that, like just go. The more time that you spend outside, the higher your likelihood of capturing an epic scene. And I can't tell you how many times I have looked out my window and thought, like, it looks pretty cloudy. Like, there could be a good sunset, but I think probably not. And, I end up just staying home. And then, of course, the sky absolutely erupts and you get a rainbow. I think actually like a double rainbow. And I'm just sitting on my front porch disappointed. Like I took this on my phone from my driveway one night and I was a very, very sad girl, to say the least. And so this is probably the best landscape tip, is just spend as much time outside with your camera as you can. Like just go, go, go. All right, tip number 3, change your perspective. It's kind of human nature as we start out shooting to kind of just shoot everything at eye level. We walk up to a beautiful scene, we get our camera out and stand up and just kind of shoot from here. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course, but changing your perspective can add a lot to your photos. It'll give people a different perspective than they usually see, which often will make things a little bit more interesting. So think about seeing things from high above, like from a plane or a helicopter, or a drone. And then on the flip side, get low down to the ground, show, that lower perspective that we don't typically see as like, 5 to 6 feet tall humans. So on this photo, I was holding my camera like off of a pier, like just hovering it right above the water. And you can tell that because the reflection of the mountain is about the same height as the actual mountain itself. And when you when you take a reflection shot like this from eye level, usually the reflection will be a little bit shorter than what is being reflected. So getting lower is another great little tip for if you are shooting any reflections, because you'll just be able to see more of that reflection. I was a little nervous that I was going to drop my camera in the water. So another tip, always use a camera strap or some way to keep hold of your camera when you're putting it in these kind of like riskier positions. And then on the right here, I got low to the ground so that I could get some foliage in the foreground. It just adds a little bit of context to where I am, and it helps to ground the photo a little bit than if there wasn't anything in the foreground. And then I've shared this photo a few times on the event space. This was taken from a helicopter, and it gives you a different perspective of a glacier, than you normally see. It kind of has a not quite a tilt shift, but it kind of makes it look a little bit miniature. And the Knik Glacier, which is where this is in Alaska, is absolutely massive. It is, I think I read about 25 miles long, 5 miles wide, and on average about 200 feet thick. So it is a big boy. And it's kind of funny how much perspective can change how something appears. Like, I feel like this looks pretty small. And then, they always say the sky's the limit, but you can go higher than that. And this was taken at about 120,000 feet from a high altitude weather balloon from my short documentary called Light Side Up. We sent a Sony a7S III with the Sony 20 millimeter f1.8G lens up in a weather balloon to capture the aurora borealis from as high as we could. Our short documentary, if you're curious to learn more about it, it's just on YouTube, so you can just search like Light Side Up. Okay, tip number 4. Know or how to know when to shoot landscape versus portrait orientation. Some landscapes demand to be shot in landscape orientation. I mean, it got that name for a reason. And some demand to be shot portrait. Social media, well, specifically Instagram, kind of forced an entire generation to shoot or at least to edit and share like only portrait-oriented photos because they tended, they performed well. And that kind of makes me sad. There are so many landscape photos out there that I wanted to share that were landscape, and I ended up, sharing a portrait version just because of, playing that social media game. And there are so many instances just where landscape orientation makes more sense for the photo, the composition. But of course, there are many instances of the opposite as well. So for example, I think that this photo is better in portrait orientation. But of course, everything that I'm gonna share here is subjective. This is kind of how I feel. But the elements in this shot are very vertically aligned, which leads your eye, up and down. So naturally, portrait is more successful here in comparison to the landscape version. You know, this is still a nice photo. There is just so much empty space on the side that's not really adding anything to the photo. We get to see like a little bit more of the mountain on the side and like a little bit more of the, the edges of the clouds. But otherwise, it's pretty much just the same photo. And you've got, everything here, like those core elements are still just like vertically aligned and centered. So I think portrait orientation wins here. Whoops. In this photo, I think this is a little bit more geared toward landscape orientation. We've got more horizontally aligned elements in this shot. The Milky Way is a little bit more horizontal. It's kind of going, it's got that left to right lean. And then this road in the foreground is very much horizontally leading our eye through the frame, as well as, kind of the mountains. This horizon line is kind of that, another horizontal line. So like, how would you even crop this into a portrait orientation photo? I was thinking about it a bit. I tried a few different options. I tried to crop it on the left side, but you miss like a lot of the core of the Milky Way. and it feels like it's a little bit too far to the right. And then the road, I think it just feels a little bit like unbalanced. Like I kind of wish the road was a little bit further to the right as well. Um, so I don't think that this quite works. I tried it on the right side of the frame, and you miss most of the Milky Way. You get a little bit of the core, but you miss most of it. But the foreground in this shot is pretty cool. Like I think the road leading your eye up vertically, leads itself a little or lends itself a little more to a portrait orientation. And it's more of a pleasing leading line than the other one. Kind of leads your eye up toward the mountains and then, into the sky. So this would be a cool foreground for a Milky Way composite, but as it is with the Milky Way over here, it kind of misses the mark a bit. And then, here's a center crop. I think that this could maybe work with a wider lens. Definitely not as I shot it here because the road gets cut off on both sides. So overall, this composition just works much better in a landscape orientation. Then here's an example where I think both orientations work because we have these horizontally aligned leading lines in the mountain layers. You'd think that maybe landscape orientation would be better, but portrait works here as well because all of these layers are kind of stacked vertically on top of one another with the cherry on top. We've got Glacier Peak or Dagobeh, the volcano here, that kind of like they lead your eye up toward it, and it's center aligned. So I think that this works in portrait orientation. And then in landscape, this is an easy example, I think, of both orientations working since you're pretty much just extending the mountains out on either side. Like nothing is changing in the sky. You still have the center subject, Dagobeh. And so even though your leading lines are more left to right, the colors are changing, with each mountain layer, thanks to that atmospheric perspective. And that helps to lead your eye up in a vertical manner as well to your main subject, the volcano. Here's a more complicated example where I think both orientations work as well, but there are elements going both vertically and horizontally through the frame. So the Milky Way gets kind of cut off on both ends, but I think it's a good balanced section of the Milky Way. You get, some of the core, you get some of the tail, and it spans the entirety of the background. So I think it still works here. It doesn't feel like super right heavy like the other portrait Milky Way crop did. And in this crop specifically, the foreground becomes more of the primary subject and the Milky Way becomes more of a secondary subject. And so things like that can happen when you're cropping photos differently as well, where you can actually change kind of the focal point or the sort of subject of your image. Whereas in the landscape orientation, I think the Milky Way feels more like the primary subject and the foreground is secondary. And so it isn't always, cut and dry where one composition has to be, better in either portrait or landscape. A photo can definitely work well in both, but that's kind of where, knowing when to use which orientation is an important skill to learn. So look for more vertically aligned elements to use in portrait orientations and horizontally aligned elements for landscape orientations. But in instances like this photo where you have elements kind of going in both directions, think about what story you're trying to tell through the image. What is your main subject? What are you trying to have the viewer focus on? What emotions are you trying to evoke as well? So all of these sort of questions will help direct you to which orientation you should use for, however you're sharing the photo. Tip number 5, use telephoto lenses. I've already talked about how much I love my Sony 100 to 400 millimeter G Master lens. But when we think of photographing landscapes, we often immediately think of really wide, expansive views because that's, what we often see, and that's, where landscape photography started. And so it's very common as we first start out shooting landscapes to go really wide, and we want to include, everything in the scene because it's so beautiful and, we want to showcase all of it. But as we go wider, we chance making our focal point smaller or weaker or not even really having one at all. Like kind of in this photo. This is just an uncropped landscape photo that I took at 70 millimeters, which is entering that telephoto range, but these mountains were pretty far away still, so it feels more like a wide view. I liked that there were some leading lines with these ridges, and there's some interesting shadows kind of coming in as the sun was going down, but there's not really a place for my eye to rest. Like, what's the subject of this photo? I'm kind of looking around hunting for a subject, a focal point. There's not really anything for my eye to just land on. And that can be a good thing if it's intentional, but it can overwhelm the viewer pretty easily. Like it's all subjective, of course, but typically having something to anchor your eye on for a bit helps to make an image stronger. So by zooming in here, we get to see, still some of those interesting shadows, and the leading line, that takes your eye around the image is still there. But then it leads your eye, up to these jagged mountains. And once your eye gets there, it can kind of rest. Like it's definitely more clear what the subject of this photo is, the mountains. But, just right off the bat, the image looks more dramatic thanks to that telephoto compression. The mountains look larger and more imposing. And even the clouds in the background look more dramatic. Like I took these photos minutes or maybe seconds apart. Like I just switched lenses, but immediately it feels more intimate and it feels more impactful. This is a wider photo that I took of the moon, which you may not have even noticed at first, because my eye immediately is drawn to these like red rocks, and then it kind of goes over to this like giant boulder in the foreground. And so the foreground really isn't doing much for me since, I was trying to showcase the moon. It's cluttered. It's very easy to miss the moon in between those rocks also, and there's not really anything interesting happening in the sky either. So by zooming in, again, I can isolate my subject more, like making it very clear what my subject is now, in comparison, to the wider shot. So by using a telephoto lens, I was able to create a more natural frame, like using the rock around the edges to help push your eye, toward the moon. And there's no busy foreground. There's not like a super empty sky. It's very much about the interaction between, that large compressed moon and this rock formation. And I was on the event space last year, I believe, talking about shooting landscapes with telephoto lenses. So if you're curious, to hear the whole talk on this, feel free to search that presentation on YouTube, or maybe someone can drop it in the chat as well. Okay, tip number 6. It's not all about the photos. I know you're probably thinking, well, but it is. But a good outdoor trip with few to no keepers is still better than being indoors. Like it's the experience of like going out and adventuring that helps to shape, who you are, both as a person and as an artist. One of the many reasons why people often become landscape photographers or become more interested in landscape photography is that we love and admire the outdoors. Being out in nature is very healing and it allows us to escape our day-to-day stressors. So even if we don't get the shot or, the shots that we were hoping for while we're out, we at least get to still reap the benefits of being outdoors. And that's still something worth celebrating, in my opinion. Like any chance that we get to be outside is a win. Plus, you may be able to learn from that experience. Like, why weren't you able to get the shot that you wanted? What happened? Was it cloud related? Were there too many clouds? Were there no clouds at all? Um, did you show up a little bit late? Did you miss like the peak of those beautiful colors, or didn't quite get set up enough in time? Did you learn something about like how the clouds affected the landscape and the light? So I think it's still always worth the adventure, even if you come home with no keepers. Okay, tip number 7, utilize scale. A scale is one of my favorite photography tools, and I'm always blown away at how much it can impact a photo. In photos, I feel like it's hard to grasp like the sense of the scale for a location without having some other element that we're familiar with its size to compare it to. So by including, some human element, something that we know the scale to be, you can clearly showcase the enormity of a landscape to create like a more interesting and dramatic shot. The viewer can also engage a bit more with the photo because they're more easily able to visualize themselves in that landscape, thanks to the scale. So in this photo, there's a teeny tiny person hiking up on this ridgeline. And it really shows the enormity of this place. It makes you feel small. It reminds you of how small we are compared to most of the features on our planet. And then the same thing with this photo on the right. There's, also someone hiking up to look out on this point, and it really gives the viewer perspective and helps them to relate to the vastness of the landscape, especially by being able to see, over these initial mountains here that this mountain range kind of continues on much further in the distance, helps to add to that scale. And also notice that I've made sure that both of these people are pretty visible. On the left, while the person is quite small, they have that white steam background, and then because they're so far away from me, they just kind of look like a dark person, like a dark little blob. So you've got that nice contrast to make them pop, even though they're so small and so far away. And then the same on the right photo, we've got a dark background for the person, and then a pretty bright red jacket, and then light colored pants. So that also helps to give them that contrast and to make them pop. Scale won't help the viewer if they can't see the element that you're using for scale. So that's definitely something to think about too. You can't just plop a person somewhere. You have to make sure that they're easily being able to be seen as well. And I know that as landscape photographers, we're often like, well, I want to photograph landscapes, not people. And I get that. But it doesn't have to always be a person used for scale. Like it can be an object like a tent, or it can be something like a small little village as well. Like it just has to be something that people are familiar with in terms of size so that they can get that sense of scale of the location that it's in. Like without the houses here, down here, it would be hard to tell just how big these mountains are in comparison. So scale is a really great and easy way to step up your shots. Number 8, be happy with where you've been. Although I love to travel, I love visiting new places, I know that I won't be able to visit every single place on the planet that I see in other photographers' work. And I'm okay with that. It can be really, really easy for us as like landscape and travel photographers to fall into like a longing trap where we're constantly in this state of needing more. And you're thinking about the next trip while you're already on a trip. And so try to be happy with where you are, be present, be in the moment, and just enjoy getting outside. This doesn't mean that you can't have drive or passion or, look forward to your next trip. Like, of course you can. It just means, don't take where you currently are or where you have been for granted. It sounds kind of cheesy, but each time, we get to go out on an adventure with our cameras really is something special. Like it really is a gift because there are so many people who will never get to experience it like we do. There are so many people who won't even get to travel outside of their own country. And so I think it's definitely something to think about and to realize and to remember that you should be grateful for everything that you're able to do. There are so many stunning places in the world that I've been fortunate enough to visit, to see and to capture, but there are thousands and thousands of beautiful places that I just won't be able to get to in my lifetime, that I won't be able to capture or to experience. And if I died tomorrow, I would be happy with everything that I've been able to do and see, and capture on this earth. So I'm always trying to remind myself, to be happy with where I've been and, to where I've been able to go and the adventures that I've been able to have. I find that it helps to keep me present on the current landscape and my current surroundings when I'm out on a trip instead of like worrying or getting too excited about what's coming next. And so being more focused and present will often result in you taking better photos as well. So be happy with where you've been. Tip number 9, less is more. Minimalism. This is a stylistic choice, but as you're starting out, do what you can to simplify elements in your composition. One of the larger challenges as nature photographers is to take, these very busy and often like complex and chaotic scenes from Mother Nature and make them into compelling photographs. And that's really hard. Like, it's really challenging, especially if you're newer to landscape photography. But often it's, the more simple scenes that end up catching viewers' eyes more. Like having fewer elements allows the viewer to look more intimately at the landscape and, to maybe even pick out shapes and things that they wouldn't have in a far busier scene. Like for instance, on the left, it kind of looks like there are human profiles carved into the rock. And then on the right, this hoodoo kind of looks like someone wearing a cowboy hat or like wearing some sort of hat. And it just lets your imagination run a little more wild. Like it just lets you visualize things and get more details into the landscape than you would otherwise, which can make it more fun for the viewer to experience and to look at. And in turn, that can make your photos more successful. It can also be used to help reinforce emotions and your intentions behind the image. Like because of this one solitary penguin on this iceberg, and all of the blue colors, like it feels sad and lonely. But the minimalism just reinforces and it pushes those emotions even further than if, there were this like incredibly beautiful and epic sunset behind, or if there were more elements in the scene. So that simplicity, the emptiness, the similar tones and kind of luminosities throughout the entire photo help to reinforce this emotion of like being sad, being lonely, or feeling kind of blue. So minimalism is something that I highly recommend if you're just getting started in landscape photography. Maybe start a little bit smaller in your compositions and then work your way out. I find that it's just a little bit easier usually. That's also why I recommend, telephoto lenses as well. They help to bring in that minimalism in the landscape versus a super wide lens where you're capturing all of these complex things. And I just find that it's a little bit easier. So minimalism is a really great thing to introduce into your landscape photography if you're not already. All right, tip number 10. We made it. We are always learning. I have learned as much or more from the bad photos that I've taken than from the good photos that I've taken. Like it's never a complete waste. And not every scene makes a good photo, and sometimes you have to learn that the hard way. Like there are just some landscapes that are absolutely stunning to look at, but just don't photograph as well. Like they just don't quite translate into a photograph. And how else do you learn that? How else do you learn how to improve, and how to get better? But you have to fail some. Like you have to fail every once in a while, and you have to learn what not to do so that you can learn what you should do. Just like a toddler, honestly. Like you have to learn that if you fall on your face, it's gonna hurt. But you're learning things around you constantly, and for some reason, I there's this belief that once you like become a professional photographer or once you become like a good photographer, you know everything there is to know about photography. And that mindset is so mind-blowing to me. I've been a full-time photographer for many years, and there is still so much that I don't know about photography, like an incredible amount that I don't know still. Like photography is wildly extensive. You know, there are so many different types of photography, and it's also an ever evolving thing. Like as new technology is coming out and as sort of trends come and go, I don't know if there's even a single person out there like right now who knows everything there is to know about photography. So there's always room to learn. There's always room to grow and to evolve as an artist. So I hope that you never stop being curious and having a desire to learn more. There's no such thing as perfection, especially in the world of art, because it's so subjective. But and this is coming from a recovering perfectionist. But I think it's a good reminder to hear every once in a while that there's no such thing as perfection. So keep watching the event space, you know, keep watching YouTube videos, you know, keep learning, keep attending workshops, you know, keep getting out there and evolving your craft and adventuring. Well, that is it for me today. I hope that you found these tips helpful. I could go on and on with so many more, but you know, maybe I'll save the rest for another day. But thank you so much for tuning in today. Again, my name is Autumn Schrock, and you can find me all around the web as Pops on all of the social medias or on my website at autumnschrock.com. And on the topic of continuing to learn, I also lead photography workshops all around the world with my partner Nate, where we take you to some of our favorite places on Earth and teach you our methods for capturing and editing them. And maybe I'll float you a few more secret tips. So you can find all of the information for our trips at inthewildworkshops.com. Thank you so much to B&H and for Sony for having me back on the event space. I always love getting to be here, and it's always such a pleasure to be on the event space. So if you have any questions for me, I would be happy to answer any. Otherwise, I will see you next time.
Thank you so much, Autumn. It's always great having you on. You're so good at what you do and so humble. And I think that's why our viewers especially love when you're on. We get such a good response. I only wish I had this about 2 weeks ago before I went on my trip. 'Cause I always was of the ilk of people who was like, "Okay, it's easy to go out there and take pictures of these beautiful landscapes." It's really not. Like, the landscapes are beautiful, but there's a ton of skill required to maximize, and I think weather, time of day, how
Mm.
you frame, like, there's so many things that play into it. I don't realize this being from out east, but it seems like every time I go out west, there's, like, haze or smoke from a wildfire that blows,
Mhm.
like, 4,000 miles across the Western United States, or just all these different factors that play in, so those tips I wanna give you a personal thank you that now I gotta take another trip back out west to
Yes, I
some of
know
those trips.
it's we're under a lot of wildfire smoke right now, specifically in Utah. There's a lot of fires in like Nevada and Idaho right now. So yeah, it's always a challenge. You like can plan these trips out and you're super excited and then it's like, oh, well, you can't even see the sun because the smoke is so thick. So yeah, that's definitely another thing to think about is like looking where you're going. Like what are the conditions like?
Yeah, every time I've
Yeah.
been to Zion, I think it's been hazy. I'm like, "Can I just get one sunset or something?" Like, I just want some sky that's not completely blown out because it's just haze, but
Yeah.
I'll save that for another day. It gives me an excuse to keep going back there. But yes,
Yeah.
as Autumn said, we're gonna open it up for any questions. I kinda wanna as we're giving people a chance to get any questions in, Autumn, what's the most underwhelming or hyped up place you think you've been to out of like the known, maybe national parks or big photography places? Is there any that stand out to you that's like, okay, there's a lot of hype behind this place, but I didn't find it as overwhelming or as exciting as everybody said. And then what's your favorite national park or state park? I'm opening it up to state parks
Mm,
because I know national parks get a lot of the credit, but there's a lot of hidden
yeah.
gems out there.
Ooh, I'm trying to think of a place that I've thought was like underwhelming. I feel like I don't typically find that. Like nothing is jumping out as something that was kind of overhyped. I feel like usually when I go to a place, I'm able to find something that I think is beautiful. Whether or not that can be like photographed super well is another thing. I'm trying to think of a place maybe specifically that is like really beautiful to look at, but like really difficult to photograph. And I can't really think of anything. I mean, I guess now that I think about it, the Knik Glacier that I posted that I shared the
Mhm.
helicopter photo from, we got down on the glacier and it was actually incredibly difficult to photograph. And I was like, this is so beautiful, but like I didn't even know where to start because you just have this like miles and miles of ice and like these cool little rivers and like I was almost a little bit overwhelmed from it, but I definitely wouldn't say that it was like overhyped. Like it was
Yeah.
incredible, just really difficult to photograph, I think.
To really grasp what was so beautiful in person and turn it into a single image or a
Yeah,
group of images.
that can be really difficult to do. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. Like they're like, oh, I'm gonna go out and take landscape photos and I'm so excited. And then there is like such a thing as a place that just does not translate to photos. Maybe it can for video, but definitely capturing single place in time, single point in time can be like very difficult to do. So that's one that I'm thinking of. And then as far as like favorite national park or state park, Mount Rainier is my favorite national park. It holds a lot of like sentimental value for me,
Okay.
not even just like that it's the most beautiful place ever, I think, but it's where I took my first hike ever and where I took my first solo hike, where I took my first astro photo. So it's got a lot of like sentimentality for me, as well as being just like an incredible mountain. But state parks, there's a state park here in Utah called Goblin Valley State Park, and it is so incredible. I'm actually surprised that it's not a national park. It is quite small, so maybe that's why, but you've got just this like hole in the ground where all of these hoodoos are like rising out, and it's a dark sky park, so it's a really fantastic place for astrophotography. And that's definitely probably, I think that's definitely my favorite state park is Goblin Valley.
Funny you say that. You know how like the phones, the computers are always listening, and
Oh.
obviously a lot of my searching has been, Zion. I went to Zion again, as I said, and it was Goblin was one that came up. It was like, hey, if you want to get away from the national park crowds, here's some places you can go, and they specifically mentioned the hoodoos, and because like it's like everyone goes to Badlands, and there's a lot of
Mhm.
little places that kind of get lost in the mix, especially in Utah. I feel like there's so much out there, so much terrain. You can kind of just go anywhere out in the desert and find something.
Totally. There are a lot of places here in Utah that aren't even like in any sort of park. It's just like this massive rock formation on the side of the road, and it's just like incredible. So yeah, there are a lot of hidden gems, I think, in the desert. Yeah.
Where does Utah rank next to you? Have you been to Alaska? You been to Alaska up
Yes.
there? What compare
Um,
them if you can. This is for me personally, everybody. Sorry. That's one of the perks of being the host. I get a little selfish at times. No, because I've never been to Alaska, and our last guest was showing stuff from Alaska, and everybody I've seen that has gone up there has just been like our last guest put it perfectly. He's like, it doesn't even feel it's like its own country. It's like it doesn't even feel like part of the country at some point.
yeah, Alaska is the best state, hands down. It's the best state. It's basically Canada, and Canada is so beautiful, right? But there are, I think, 8 national parks, like for a reason. It's first of all, it's massive, but secondly, it is just like the most incredible place, I think, in the states that I've been. Like it is 100% best state. So sorry, Utah. I really love Utah. I love Washington and the Pacific Northwest, but Alaska is the winner, of course. Yep. You gotta go.
All right. All right. I'm partial to Utah too. I have family from there. So
Yeah,
uh
Utah is really special.
beautiful.
It's just very different. Like comparing Utah and Alaska is kind of tough because it is kind of like comparing oranges to apples because there's like no desert up there. Um, But I think it depends on what you're wanting to photograph too. Like landscapes are incredible there, but there's so many like amazing wildlife opportunities too. Of course, like you've got all the bears there and whatnot. But like we did a scenic flight around Denali, and that was like the most ridiculous thing ever. It was so, so beautiful. And the same at Wrangell St. Elias, which is I think one of the more uh underhyped, I guess, places is Wrangell St. Elias. I think partly because it's hard to get to. Like you have to like fly or like hike to see the park. But taking a flight around there was absolutely incredible. Like one of the most beautiful national parks that I've ever seen. So I definitely recommend making a trip to Alaska. And if you do, I would say at least 2 weeks if you can, because it's such a huge state. I feel like you've got to see all of it. Like it's so beautiful. So that would
There
be
we go.
my
Event
advice.
space live from Alaska. I'm gonna start willing it. Let's see if
Yes.
we
Oh
can
my
make it happen.
gosh.
We'll bring you and Nate. We'll figure something out. Yeah. There
That
we
would be
go.
sweet. Yeah.
Yeah.
He
Team
would
behind
he
the
feels the
scenes.
same. Yeah, he feels the same as
Really?
he's like Alaska's the best state. And I'm like, yes. He told me
See, I
that
trust you
before.
guys.
No.
I trust you guys. People like me who's like, I'm in New York 11.9 months out of the year. I got to trust you guys. You
That's
guys have been
fair.
all around. So
That is fair. Like he had been there a few times before I had been there, and I remember him telling me like it's the best state, you're gonna just love it. And I was kind of like, yeah, I'm sure I'll like it, but like I've seen so many beautiful things, and then it just like blew everything out of the water. Like it's so gorgeous.
well, that's why I was really interested in because you guys are from out where like people out east just have no idea. Like so I always wonder like if you are from out west and you're kind of used to it, it's one thing I go to see mountains and it's like, wow, waking up every day, they're so big. It's like, wow. But for
Mhm.
you guys, like, is it hard to still be enamored with the place? So I guess not.
Definitely not. Well, for me, I think it's a little bit different. So I grew up in Indiana, which is very mountain free. One of the flattest states that exists. And so I actually didn't even see a mountain. Well, I guess I saw the Great Smoky Mountains, but no offense, they're
Not
mountains
the same.
in comparison.
I'll say
Um,
it.
yeah, they're hills, big hills. But I'd never seen like a proper like mountain until I was in my 20s, like 23 maybe or something like that. And so I still feel like even though I've lived in Seattle for a decade and I live now in Utah for 3.5 years, um, like I have been around mountains a lot now, but it's still every single time I see one, I feel like I still get that like shock and awe just because I spent, I think, so many years not seeing anything like that. And I think it's different, like for people like Nate, where he grew up in the mountains of Colorado, so he's very used to mountains. But I think luckily his parents kind of like ingrained in him like how beautiful nature is, so he does still appreciate things too. But yeah, it is different for people, I think, who are either living in a place that has no mountains and are able to go see them, um, than like someone who grew up in the mountains, if that makes sense.
Totally. Totally.
Yeah,
All right,
I don't
I'll stop sidetracking. I know we have a couple
know.
questions that came in. Good
Okay.
question. We can all relate to this one. We go out with a group of people. How do we set ourselves apart rather than everybody just posting up their tripods and taking the same picture?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's actually one of my favorite parts of photography is like you can put 10 people in a room and you can get 10 different photos as long as you're not like all looking at what each other is shooting and like, oh, I want to shoot that too. I think it is hard when you're in a group to try to have like more of a solo, like your own vision. But I think it's important to remember that. Like it's totally cool if you all want to like post up and take some photos, but I think it's important to remember to like, okay, I'm gonna get off the tripod. I'm gonna go off and on my own and try to find some different new thing that not everyone else is shooting. I think that's a really, really important part of any photography, really, but I think especially landscape photography because we do tend to flock in groups together. Um, so yeah, I think just making sure that you're still having fun with the group, but also that you're each able to go off and kind of do your own thing here and there is really important to growing as an artist.
Mhm. Taking pictures of each other, not just focusing on the scene. You gotta, maybe it's me. I was always the one that documents the group, probably because my landscape photos sucked, but
I love that. See, I'm so bad at that. I'm like so introverted, I think, that I like and photographing people is really not my forte. Like I look up to people that can do that. So I was never the one, or I'm still never the one who's like taking photos of Nate. I have to consciously be like, okay, take a photo of Nate. Can't forget to do that. So that's interesting. I think it's always good to have someone in the group who does that though.
Yeah, you always remember that's tip number 11. Find the bad landscape
Yes.
photographer. They're the
Yes. Find
dedicated
the
BTS
yeah,
photographer.
the landscape slash portrait photographer.
Yeah, there you go. Bonus
Yeah.
tip. So you guys already got a bonus tip. Last question, we'll close it out here. I'm going to Yosemite for a gig and I want to get a sunrise time lapse. Do you have any advice
Mm.
to maintain exposure? Any exposure advice for time lapse or sunrise, sunset?
Sure, sure. Yosemite is beautiful. You're gonna have an amazing time. For like a sunrise or a sunset time lapse, I would recommend instead of having your camera exposing like manually, I would do aperture priority. So that your camera is kind of making some adjustments for you. So when you're shooting a time lapse, you don't want your aperture to change because that can introduce like different just vignetting in the frame and also just different focus points can or focal I guess like what's in focus can change as well, and that can affect how your time lapse looks. So I would recommend aperture priority and then just setting your aperture at the widest aperture that you can, and then your camera will adjust for you like your expo or your shutter speed, and you can even do auto ISO if you want, and you can set like a maximum so it doesn't go too high. But that would be my recommendation if you're not super familiar with doing time lapses when the light is changing as much as like, sunrise or sunset. But otherwise, I hope you have an amazing trip. Yosemite is so, so beautiful.
Other place I haven't been. Add it to the list.
Well, it's
And
really gorgeous. Yeah.
as Autumn said, you've done a ton with us here at B&H, not just the event space, but B&H as a whole. So there's tons of different tips and topics. She's covered everything from gear to travel to night to really everything under the sun. Who don't dad joke.
Nice.
Huge thank you again, Autumn, for joining us once again. And a huge thank you to Sony for hosting and our viewers
Yes.
out there. We can't do it without you guys. We always do it for you. Free education here at the B&H Event Space. That's all we have for you for now. Another edition of the Event Space, and now in the books. Catch y'all next time.
Bye.